Hello again, everybody. I hope you're all doing well. Welcome back to another pre-recorded lecture. Today, we're going to be going over chapters 6 and 7 of Preble's art forms. Just giving the disclaimer again, this pre-recorded lecture series is based off of both Preble's art forms and also taking inspiration from a pre-recorded lecture series that my cohort Erica Lewis made, who I will be linking in the description. But let's get right into it. Today we're talking about drawing and painting. Chapter 6 is drawing, so let's start with that. As an introduction to drawing is an immediate and accessible way to communicate through imagery, and it conveys an artist's imaginings, or at least it can. So here is an example of not conveying imaginings, but conveying what was in front of them. But these shelter drawings by Henry Moore, they depicted Londoners as they were sheltering from Nazi bombing raids, and they offered a valuable way to record events when cameras couldn't function. And Moore was actually named an official war artist because of this drawing series. So this is a very powerful image of Londoners all bunkered together as they shelter from bombs. So right off the bat, we can see that drawing can be used for some very powerful things. But looking forward, here are some examples of sketchbooks. Also, children often draw before reading or writing, but it is a learned process. To define drawing, it means to pull, push, or drag a marking tool across a surface to leave a line or mark. So that's the quite literal definition of drawing. And sketchbooks, as you can see here, are mainly for developing ideas or taking notes. So on the left, you can see one of Leonardo da Vinci's pages of his sketchbook. And then on the right, you can see one of the pages from Guillermo del Toro's sketchbook, where he planned all of Pan's Labyrinth. His sketchbooks for this are incredibly impressive. So much detail went into all of the planning behind it, and it's all recorded in sketchbooks. I mean, they're in Spanish, but you can still see from the drawings. So yeah, sketchbooks are a good way to start with drawing, to practice, and to get out your ideas in order to plan for larger pieces. Now, I want to talk quickly about the difference between receptive and projective drawing. So receptive drawing attempts to capture the physical appearance of something that's before us. It's drawing from life. So on the left here, you can see an example of that by Mary Cassatt, where she captured a family group or a group, I think it's a family. They're on public transportation. So she's literally sitting on a train, drawing whoever's in front of her. That's receptive. On the other hand, we have projective drawing, and that is when you draw something that only exists in your mind. So things like drawing from imagination or drawing from your dreams. On the right, you can see an example of this, which is Untitled number 111 by Martin Ramirez. And in this, you can see animals are suspended in space on levitating platforms and shapes. And clearly this work is based on imagination. None of this is really possible to happen in real life, but it is a way that you can make the unreal real in a sense. You can make it at least visible to others. Now, drawing is a part of the creative process, and many artists regard drawing as deeply important. Even if drawing isn't their main medium, they regard it as an important step of the process. Some artists present exceptional ability to draw as children, but some of them have to develop it later in life and don't even start picking up a pencil or pen and drawing until they're in their 20s or 30s. Two very famous artists that didn't start drawing until they were much older are Paul Cézanne and actually Vincent van Gogh. And you can see in these are two drawings from Vincent van Gogh made 2 years apart, and you can see just how much growth happened over 2 years in his ability to draw and make something more realistic and more captivating. Also, an important thing to notice is that good drawings can appear deceptively simple. The more it seems intuitive and like I don't know what other word to use besides simple. Oftentimes that takes a lot more practice and years of training in order to pull off. So things that do look more simple can oftentimes take a lot more practice just over the years building up the sort of motor skills to do. Now, drawing serves three functions. One of them is notation, so like a sketch or a record of something that's been seen, that you remember or that you imagined. Also, as a study or preparation for another, usually larger and more complex work, so like making preliminary sketches for a painting. And as an end in itself, a complete work of art. So some drawings are not meant to be paintings or concepts for movies, like in the case of Guillermo del Toro, or larger artworks later. Sometimes the drawing itself is the finished piece of art. Now here's an example of one of Michelangelo's studies. This is Reclining Male Nude. This was a study for the painting of one of the figures on the Sistine Chapel ceiling. You might recognize it's Adam in the creation of God and Adam. But there's a lot of careful drawing from observation here, having a model in front of him. And also, there's repetition of parts that Michelangelo thought needed further study. So if he's really good at drawing this like muscly torso, but he's not very good at drawing the hand, then he'll make more and more studies of the hand until he feels like the hand is up to par with his drawing skills for the rest of the body. So really focusing on the parts that you think are your weakest in preliminary sketches and building up that strength to kind of even everything out. Now here is an example of a piece that had tons of drawings as studies beforehand. This is Picasso's Guernica. On the bottom you can see the finished piece, and on the top you can see two of the preliminary drawings, but there were so many of these. 45 studies that went into the process of making Guernica have been preserved, but there are apparently a lot more than that haven't been preserved. Some say up to 200 sketches went into the preparation for this painting. But yeah, in the first one, especially in the upper left, you can see these gestural lines really convey the work's essence without showing the actual details. And then the more he drew and the more he got in his head what he wanted to put on the paper, he put more details as he went. So preliminary sketches are generally not considered finished pieces, but they are treasured anyway. For a lot of people see it as the intrinsic beauty of the process, or just being able to see the mark of the artist. A lot of people, especially if it's a very famous artist, find it very valuable to be able to see the process behind it, even though it's not the finished piece. Also, I just want to give a little, I don't know if disclaimer is the word, but I feel like every time I tell you guys about a famous artist that I know is not a good person, I just want to give a little disclaimer of that, because we can talk all day about how influential Picasso was, but I also want you all to know that he abused women. There is a difference between being a good artist and a good person. So this is one of those cases of good artist, bad person. Just wanted to put that out there before we move on. And then also, here we're looking at lines, and I know we kind of talked about hatching and cross-hatching and contour hatching and contour drawings in the lecture where we were talking about line, but I did want to kind of go over it a little bit more because I have these images here. So for the three kind of squarish shapes of hatching, you can see on the far left, there's just hatching. In the middle, there's cross-hatching. And then on the right, there is contour hatching, where it goes with the shapes of something. And that's not to be confused with a contour drawing. So I put an example of a contour drawing on the far right. This one is by Egon Schiele. And I explained this before, but just to kind of quickly go over it, a contour drawing is just the outside lines defining the shapes. It's not like shading. So I just wanted to put an example of a contour drawing there so that we could really like nail that point down. And then also here's just an image of a bunch of different drawing tools and the types of lines that they create. But moving on from that, an example of using all three methods of hatching, the hatching, cross-hatching, and contour hatching, is here in this sketch by Bartolomeo Passarotti. And in this, you can see there's simple hatching on the standing figure up in the back kind of upper right. There's contour hatching on the upper side of the bulging arm, so you can see the hatching is curved to match the shapes of the body of the muscles itself. And then on the darker areas, you can see there's cross hatching in order to provide that darker perceived value. Now, printmakers especially use all three types of hatching to suggest mass and shadow, but this is just an example of it in drawing and sketching. Now, let's get into drawing materials. So first of all, what do you draw on? You need some paper. There are some qualities of paper that I'd like you to understand. So paper has a tooth to it. It can have more tooth or less tooth to it, and that is the surface texture. So a higher texture is better for more loose, dry materials like charcoal. It'll hold that more. Whereas a smoother texture is better for if you're just working with like a fine graphite pencil. The weight of a paper is measured by the weight of the full ream of paper, so that is 500 sheets altogether. And it basically shows you how thick and durable the paper is. It can range from printer paper, which is about 20 pounds for a whole ream of 500 sheets, to watercolor paper, which is 140 to 300 pounds of weight for a ream, which is 500 sheets of that. And also, whether or not paper is archival is something to note. So archival paper is acid-free, and it's mainly there for the longevity of the drawing, and it prevents yellowing. So basically, if you want your drawing to last 10, 15, 20, 50, 100 years from now, if it's something that would be going in a museum, you definitely want it to be archival. Whereas if you're just kind of sketching for yourself, you really don't have to worry about that. Now let's get into the different types of media that people use for drawing, starting with dry media. These include pencil, charcoal, Conte crayon, and pastel. They come in varying degrees of hardness, which controls the darkness and line quality that you can get using these tools. And the softer that the hardness of your drawing tool is, the darker your mark will come out generally. So here's an example that uses a variety of tools and techniques. This is States of Mind, The Farewells by Umberto Boccioni. So this uses a bunch of different dry media here. But let's get into specifics. So charcoal is a form of dry media. This is an example here. This is Vija Clemens' Web number 5. And charcoal, with that, you can put down a lot of dark passages very quickly. You can make a lot of dark marks over a short amount of time. But not all particles of the charcoal bind to the surface. That's why you need a paper with more tooth to it. Also, usually when you're working with charcoal, you need to set it with a thin fixative varnish to prevent smudging. So when we use charcoal in this class, I highly recommend that you go out and get yourself a can of matte fixative. Go outside to spray it, don't spray it in your house, and just spray it all over the charcoal so that it doesn't, it'll just smudge everywhere. If you even barely touch it or just wave it in the wind, it'll smudge everywhere, and the fixative prevents that. Also, you can get a wide range of values from charcoal. That's another quality of the medium. Now looking at something that is similar to charcoal, but different. This is Conte crayon. It's basically graphite mixed with clay, and it feels like a smaller, harder piece of charcoal. It resists smudging more so than charcoal does. It's a variation of charcoal, pretty much. But you're able to get away with not using a fixative most of the time, things like that. So this example is L'Echo by Georges Père-Sirot, and we actually looked at a zoomed in cropped picture of this earlier to look at the tooth of the paper, but this is the full piece, and it's done primarily with Conti crayon. Now, another form of dry media is pastels, like oil pastels or any form of pastels. They have similar characteristics to natural chalk, but they're a bit more wet, if that makes any sense. It's like a very fancy crayon, but like wetter and softer. They're mostly made of pigment with very little binding material, so it's a lot of color there. And they don't allow much detail, although it can be achieved, as you can see in this example. It just takes a lot of practice in order to get detail when you're working with pastels. So pastels generally have more color because graphite, charcoal, things like that are usually just in grayscale, but pastels come in all forms of colors. Now let's look at some examples of liquid media in drawing. So this is mainly just ink. It includes black or brown inks or washes of inks, which is just ink mixed with water. The more water you put in it, the less opaque it'll be. And also felt and fiber-tipped marker pens. So if you use an ink pen or a brush tip ink pen, anything like that, that is all liquid media. Now, here's an example. This is Tuning the Seismin by Hokusai. You might know Hokusai from his most famous painting, The Great Wave, but this is an ink drawing from Hokusai. And this has a sort of elegance of line created by having a lot of control over a brush that really responds to gentle changes in pressure or tilt. So it takes a lot of practice to be able to control the line quality so well. But whenever it is mastered, it's very elegant and beautiful to look at. And it is actually the same brush generally used for writing and drawing and Chinese calligraphy specifically. So that is an example of liquid media. And then also here's another example. This is Eliza and Rebecca at the Well by Rembrandt van Rijn, or a lot of people just call him Rembrandt. And this is a compositional arrangement for a possible painting. We don't know because we haven't seen the painting itself, but it looks like it could be a preliminary sketch for a potential painting. But some things to note about this example are that there's light and shade using white gouache, which is a sort of opaque watercolor. Here is another more contemporary example of liquid media. This is a piece by William Kentridge, and he creates these drawings and offers them as finished works. They're not preliminary for anything else. And this piece is called Drawing for Lulu, and it used both wet and dry media over pages of an obsolete dictionary. So a dictionary that there's updated versions of it. People don't use it anymore. But it basically represents this faded authority of language and working over top of that, showing the authority of image over language. As for some more contemporary approaches to drawing, oftentimes drawing is used in combination with other media nowadays. Here's an example. This is Back to Gondwana Land by Julie Mehretu. I'm totally botching that last name. I'm so sorry. This is what happens when you learn things from reading instead of hearing someone say it out loud. My bad. But this is made of swatches of cut paper along with drawn ink lines. So the cut paper is collaged onto the piece, and then ink lines are added underneath and over top of the paper. And the shapes kind of suggest this impersonal public space that today's mass-produced world has. If you look closely, you can kind of see a sort of architectural sketch or architectural backgrounds in there. It looks a lot like large public spaces, such as like a train station. You might not be able to see unless you're looking on a larger screen, but it's definitely got these architectural motifs in the background. Looking at another contemporary approach, this is Reconnaissance by Christine Hybert, and she really works with the space in unconventional modes of drawing. A lot of people are upset by how simple it is, but if you think about it, I mean, it is creating a mark on a space, and it is most definitely bringing it into the third dimension and working with all these different angled planes of space in the room that she is working on. These lines are made directly on the walls with blue tape. It's blue tape that's normally used by painters to mask off negative spaces, but in this case it's just used to create the lines itself, and they resemble drawn lines, but they are not drawn lines. They're painter's tape. I feel like a lot of people have either really strong positive or negative opinions about this. People oftentimes really don't like work that they think is easy to make, even though if you think about all the ladders she had to get on to do this, it wasn't actually that easy. But I'd love to hear your thoughts on this in our discussion in class. Another contemporary approach, this is number 334 by Ingrid Calamy. And this is a colored pencil drawing made from taking rubbings in an abandoned steel plant in New York and the Los Angeles River. So this is really using found textures to create basically found imagery, but she's making the imagery by taking these rubbings. Now, another thing to note is that a rapidly growing number of artists are routinely employing digital screen-based drawing techniques. Here's an example of that. This is from the series The Selfie Drawings, and this is by Carla Ganis. So this is actually a self-portrait that has been digitally manipulated. She added text and drawing, she added layers of colors, she cropped and duplicated things. There's a lot going on here, from taking just the selfie to creating this finished product, and pretty much all of it is happening digitally. Now, even just since this book was written, there have been some major developments in digital drawing. So I just wanted to note that touchscreen tablets such as the Wacom or the iPad Pro now have pin pressure and tilt sensitivity, so it can tell how hard you're pushing down with your pen and also whether or not you're tilting your pen slightly to the side. And this can create an incredibly realistic drawing experience. And basically, it's just changing the industry at an incredible pace. So that really wasn't noted in the book, but I think it's important for y'all to know that drawing tablets are definitely a thing taking the industry by storm. So that's all for drawing. Let's go into chapter 7, which is on painting. So as an introduction to this, drawing and painting are very closely related. They're overlapping processes, and drawing is often a prelude to painting, like you saw in those preliminary sketches before. This is an example of painting where really the medium and process of the application are part of the message. So this is not so much about the shapes on it as much as the application of paint itself. This is abstract painting by Gerhard Richter. And also, for many people, when you think of art, the first thing you think of is painting. So this is a very important medium to learn about. But before we can get any further, I'd like to go over what is paint. Like, what is paint made of? There are 3 ingredients in all paint. There's pigment, binder, and then there's a vehicle. So, excuse me. Pigments provide color, usually in the form of fine powder. They must be stable while drying, and they have to resist fading over time, or else they're not a good pigment. Also, advances in the chemical industry in the 19th and 20th centuries allowed for synthetic pigments in a range of stable colors, and that's very helpful because a lot of things that we were making pigments out of before were either very rare or also could be toxic, such as cadmium red. But yeah, so the pigment is basically what the color itself is. Now, binders are what holds the pigment particles together. So in oil paint, the binder contains linseed oil. That's the oil. That's the binder for oil paint. For tempera paint, the binder for that is actually egg yolk. For acrylic, there's synthetic binders, but basically binders are what holds the pigment together. And then vehicles are what makes paint a liquid and can be further added for thinning. So in oil paint, the vehicle for that is turpentine. So in order to thin oil paint, you have to add more turpentine to it. And for watercolors, the vehicle for that is water. The way to thin watercolor is to add more water. But you have to add the correct vehicle for what type of paint you're using. Otherwise, oil and water don't mix. You can't thin oil paint with water. It just won't work. There are some forms of weird genetically engineered water-based oil paint, but I'm not counting those because that's a weird new invention. So basically, pigment's the color, binder's what hold it together, and vehicles is what you thin it down with. Another important sort of ingredient to the painting process is the support. So when you paint, you have to be painting on something. The support is the structure underneath the painting, and it has to be sealed. So usually you seal something that you're going to paint on with a primer in order to give it a uniform surface and in order to allow the paint to bond to that surface and not just chip off later. That's why you paint on one side of the canvas that has primer on it and not the other side that doesn't, because it'll actually rot over time if you don't do it on the right side of the canvas. A common primer that people use for making things ready to accept paint is gesso, but there's lots of different types. But basically, you can't just paint on a plain canvas. There has to be some kind of primer on it. But most of them you buy and they're already primed. So now let's get into some examples of all the different types of paint. And I can talk a little bit about each one. And that's pretty much what all the rest of this lecture is going to be. So let's start off with watercolor. Watercolor is a water-based paint media that's been used for thousands of years. The pigments are mixed with water as a vehicle, and the binder is gum arabic. To use watercolor, you need to use a thicker, stronger paper. If you use a thin paper, it's going to not be able to accept all of the water and hold it, and it's going to buckle up and become all wrinkly and weird. So you actually have to use thick paper when you're doing this. The most common support for this is white rag paper, and also people like that because it doesn't require any priming. You can just use the white rag paper, and it doesn't have to come pre-primed. Watercolor usually starts with a sort of staining technique, applying paint in thin translucent washes with lots of water as the vehicle, watering it down. And then for watercolor, highlights are obtained by leaving areas of white paper unpainted. And in this way, it's kind of an unforgiving medium. Once you darken an area with watercolor, you can't make it light again. Some people will block out areas that they know that they'll want to remain white using something called the resist, such as painter's tape or actually rubber cement, and then pull that off after. But really, unless you're willing to go back over it with a different type of paint, like white gouache or white acrylic or something like that, you really can't make something lighter once you make it dark with watercolor. And also people will, once they have the highlights blocked out and the thin translucent layers everywhere, people will go in with details for something that's more opaque. And when I say opaque, I mean something that's not translucent. So this example is Great Yarmouth Harbor, Norfolk by J.M.W. Turner. And that is just, a famous watercolor painting. But it can be a very, pretty romantic type of painting, especially when you have a lot of water on the page and then you drop a bit of watercolor into it and it splooshes everywhere. It's a very, no pun intended, but it is a very fluid form of media. A lot of people like to use it for landscapes and scenes of nature because of that. But here's another example of watercolor, and this is some traditional Chinese watercolor. They have a certain technique where the artist employs water-based black ink and often uses ink without color. In this case, there is ink and watercolor in this. This is Five Deer Hermitage by Li Shida. But in the Chinese tradition, they often regard painting as having descended from calligraphy. Calligraphy is the primary, where everything started, and then people started realizing, I can use this brush to make a shape that isn't like a letter or a word. I can use it to make a shape of a house or a shape of a tree, and then it kind of went forward from there. So a lot of these techniques start with the techniques that they use for calligraphy. Now let's look at fresco. When you're talking about fresco, people will often say buon fresco, which means true fresco, and that just means that it's like actually fresco and not fake fresco. People feel the need to clarify that, but that's the thing. So for fresco or true fresco, pigments are suspended in water and applied to damp lime plaster surface. The plaster dries quickly, so only the portion that can be painted that day is prepared. Basically, you're making it bind directly to what the wall is made out of, so it won't flake off. It is actually a part of the wall itself. And in this, there's, like how the plaster dries quickly, that's a very rapid staining process. So scientifically what's going on, kind of like on a microscopic level, is the lime forms calcium crystals that chemically bind the pigment to the wall itself. And this makes a very durable surface, but it is best suited to drier climatic zones. Too much humidity can mess it up. And this was very popular in Renaissance Italy. Frescoes were the favored medium for painting on church walls especially, such as Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel ceiling, or in this example, this is assumed portrait of Francesco Maria della Rovere, but it's a detail from the School of Athens, which we looked at in another, I forget if it was like the second or third. We were talking about perspective and we looked at the School of Athens. This is a detail from that, but this is a fresco, so that's an example of that. Also, more recently, fresco has made a revival in Mexico in the 1920s, and this is specifically because the government decided to put more funding into the arts and show their support of arts by funding art to be made on public buildings and in public buildings. And through that, fresco, where it binds directly to the wall, seemed like the right thing to use. Now, a leader in this movement was the artist Diego Rivera, and he was invited by the Detroit Institute of Arts to create a mural. So that's what you're looking at here. This is Detroit Industry, and it's a blend of traditional and contemporary subject matter, but also using a very traditional material that is fresco. So that's fresco. Now let's look at encaustic. Encaustic is pigments that are suspended in hot beeswax, or just wax in general. But yeah, wax is the binder and the vehicle, and when you work with it, you create these very lustrous, very shiny, rich-looking surfaces. This technique was known to ancient Greeks, and it especially flourished in Egypt during the time that they were colonized by Rome, and was generally used for what is called fayum portraits, which were memorials to the deceased. So here's an example of that. It's a portrait of a boy. We don't know the artist's name, but basically this is pigments in wax. Now, temperature control is very necessary when you're working with encaustic because it is wax, and if it's too hot, it will quite literally melt. And even though it's easier to control temperatures now with heating and air conditioning and all of that, it is still less commonly used today. I think people just think that it's too much hassle. However, some artists do use encaustic in modern and contemporary time periods. So one example of this is Jasper Johns. He was a modern artist who used encaustic. So this was in the 1950s. When you say modern, you don't mean contemporary is like literally right now. Modern is a period that was around this time. But it is still closer to nowadays than... I'm getting off topic. Anyways, this is Three Flags by Jasper Johns. And you can see this waxy consistency of paint yields a very textured surface. And because of that, you can see nearly every single brush stroke that he made. So you do get a very, very gorgeously complex surface with this, although it is a complicated medium to work with. Now let's look a little bit at tempera. Tempera was known to Greeks and Romans and developed during the Middle Ages, and it actually uses egg yolks as the binder. And the egg yolks are mixed equally with pigment, and then you thin it with water. So in this case, the binder is the egg yolk, the pigment is the pigment, and the vehicle is the water. And when you're finished with it, it creates a matte surface. And when I say matte, I mean something that is not shiny. So there are some advantages and disadvantages to tempera. The advantages are you can achieve really sharp lines and precise details, and also it doesn't darken with age. It's very archival. But also some disadvantages are during the drying process, the colors do change. So when you first paint it down wet, it'll be a bit different later once it's dry. Also, it's very difficult to rework. Once it's down and it's dry, you really can't change it. And so because of that, you have to do a pale underpainting and like really methodically put down everything where you want it to go. And you can't mess up or else you won't be able to go back in and fix it. So this is an example of tempera painting. This is The Waiting Room by George Tooker. And in this, you can see the execution was painstaking. There was so much time and effort that went into making this exactly how it was. It's a very challenging medium to work with, especially with such high detail like in this piece. And Tooker actually said that the slowness of working in tempera fit his way of thinking. And I can understand this. Sometimes having a long time to really meditate on what you're trying to say with a piece can be helpful, but it definitely is a huge pain to work with. And with that being said, let's get into the golden child, everyone's favorite, or at least in recent years, oil paint. So oil paint has been a favorite medium of Western art specifically for 5 centuries. The linseed oil recipe was perfected by 15th century Flemish artists. And in this example, this is Madonna and Child with the Chancellor Roland by Jan van Eyck. And this was on a gesso-covered wood panel. He used glazing techniques or a transparent film of color. So that's when you really lay down lots and lots of thin, transparent, or translucent coats of paint. And you're able to get really lifelike kind of skin textures there. And also there's a lot of very refined, very detailed textures in here. If you look at the velvet especially, or the hair, it's just very masterful. So there are some advantages and disadvantages to oil paint as well. So the advantages are it provides both increased opacity and, when thinned, greater transparency. So you can really control how opaque your paint is. Also, there's a really slow drying time, so you can go back in and fix and change things for a very long time before it dries. Also, the pigments change very little when drying. So when you put the paint down, that's what it's going to look like when it's dry. It's not going to darken a little bit over the next couple hours. And also, oil paint is rather flexible, so you can use canvases and like roll them up and stuff, which is something that you're not able to do with most other types of paints. Now, some of the disadvantages of oil paint is that oil paint is toxic without proper ventilation. I mean, I remember in high school, I was like oil painting in a maintenance closet with no ventilation. Don't do that. That is so bad for you. Just wasting brain cells on stupidity and not using proper ventilation. Also, you have to thin oil paint with turpentine or other expensive oils like safflower oil or linseed oil, but mainly you have to thin it with turpentine, and that is also really toxic, and you need more ventilation for that too. Also, the slow drying time of oil is not ideal for all artists. Some people like to work in thin layers and have them dry in between, and if that's the case for oil, then you have to wait like a week between layers because it literally takes so long to dry. So depending on the way that you paint, the slow drying time can be either an advantage or a disadvantage. Now here is another example so that we can kind of look at the application techniques of oil paint. So there is impasto, which is when you put really thick layers and you can really see the brush strokes come up off of the canvas. Then you can also do thinned application of oil paint. And like I said earlier, lots and lots of very thin layers is called glazing. And then there are two other kind of ways of differentiating techniques for oil. So there's wet onto wet. This is also called direct painting because you can complete it in one sitting. You're not having to wait for layers to dry in between time. But your colors can get pretty muddy if you're not careful because it's all kind of blending in together while you're doing it. And then there's also wet onto dry, which is where you have to wait a pretty long time for your layer to dry and then come back and put another layer of wet oil paint on top of that dry oil paint. Now, this piece, Rembrandt's Indulgence Was Van Gogh's Dilemma by Tom Woodle. Sorry, something about that name was just really funny to me. Anyway, this is a really small work. It's about 4 inches by 3 inches. It is a direct painting. So like I said earlier, it was all done in one sitting. There wasn't any waiting for layers to dry. You can see there's impasto technique near the top of the work. You can really see the thick brush strokes, like where there's that blue. And at one point, really up close to the top left, you can actually see a shadow of how thick the brush stroke is. So that is an example of impasto. Also, all of this yellow paint that you can see, it was thinned by turpentine in order to make it create those thinner washes. And also the smoothed brush strokes in the chalice in the middle there, that really, you can tell that that's a lot more realistic than all of the sort of background around it. Those smoothed brush strokes in the middle heighten that sort of trompe l'oeil quality, which we've talked about before. It's fooling the eye. So having the very realistic kind of fooling the eye style on the chalice and having that be contrasted by the very unrealistic brushstrokes all around it, that is just a part of this piece, basically. Now, the last form of paint that we'll be getting into is acrylic. Acrylic was invented in the mid-20th century, and the binder for acrylic paint is acrylic polymer, which is synthetic. And basically, acrylic is actually like a form of plastic. Like when it is dry, it is a form of plastic. And the vehicle for acrylic is water, which is a lot more convenient to use than turpentine, which is toxic. Also, acrylic is a relatively permanent paint. It rarely darkens or yellows with age, so it has that archival quality to it. And it has a very rapid drying time, which could be seen as a disadvantage. But if you're one of those artists that likes to work in layers and have your layer completely dry before you put on the next layer, then that is actually an advantage. So this example is by Yoonhee Min, and this is an artist that very much takes advantage of the qualities of acrylic paint itself. This example is Into the Sun number 10, and in it she uses pure bright shades and actually applies the paint with a squeegee. But you can really see the way that the colors, when made to be not at full opacity, make these sort of transparent layers over each other as they were able to be applied on a dried surface pretty quickly. So those are all different types of paints, and that pretty much wraps up this lecture for now. And I can't wait to see you guys in class and discuss all of this. And then I guess digitally, I'll see you in the next pre-recorded lecture. So have a good one.